kind of cold out here, but I'm still feeling the burn, guys. Alright, so given the history with politicians in this country, I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. But this man that I'm about to introduce to you guys is an unapologetic supporter of Bernie Sanders. He's feeling the burn. He gets it. Ladies and gentlemen, New York State Legislator Martin Simpson.
I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is in the Capital District and the areas that we're touching, we're gonna get Bernie through. But in the balance of New York State, I don't know. If the election was held tomorrow, it probably would be a Trump election. That's because of the media and because of the Democratic leadership has had their foot on the scale for Hillary Clinton. And I was listening to MSNBC this morning, and you know, they keep talking about, well, you know, how can Bernie get his programs through? It's not realistic, and how, you know, the older generation, especially of women, are thinking that Hillary has an entitlement just because she's a female, but that's not enough. It's not enough. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and unfortunately, you know, people in this country are very telegenic and not very scholarly. We're one of the few countries in the world where you can speak one language poorly and be considered educated. Most people in the world speak at least 2 or 3 different languages. But I remember in 1959, my grandmother, who was a salt to the earth, a true soul food grandmother, saw some NAACP workers being arrested, and her comment was, must be the communists behind it. I don't have a lot of hope for the black community from Charleston. It's terrible that the Democratic leadership has hid Bernie's light under a bushel by having these ridiculous debates competing on weekends with popular football games. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that Hillary Clinton has a long history of being in the public eye, and very few people know about Bernie Sanders. But when it comes to consistency, Hillary is nowhere near Bernie. For those people who weren't alive in the 60s, Bernie was actually an organizer for the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And for those people who were too young to remember the 60s, look it up. Look up Roy Innis, look up Stokely Carmichael, AKA Kwame Ture. The mass media gives us disinformation. I'll give you a classic example. During the anti-apartheid campaign, the New York Times would have you believe that Gotcha Buthelezi from the Zulu Nation was anti-apartheid revolutionary on par with Nelson Mandela, but the truth was he was working with the regime. So our generation now with social media has more information than ever before, but less critical intelligence to determine what's right from what's wrong. So they have entropy, they have information overload. So that's the struggle we have to deal with. For the black community, I want to say Hillary Clinton started out in high school as a Goldwater girl. She also worked for other Republican campaigns at a time when not far removed from when Bernie Sanders was being arrested as a student at the University of Chicago for fighting segregation. But what we have to do is we have to make the demand that if in fact it comes to a Hillary Rodham Clinton candidacy, that we get major concessions in the Democratic platform before Bernie turns over his supporters. I'm not conceding defeat yet, but the trend of Republicans, they're out manning us in terms of the turnout. They're getting more bodies out. Hillary is very shrill. You know, Al Franken was touting her virtues as a policy wonk. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that the Iraq War was a setup. Like most of the setups in our lifetime, there's probably not a just war. Most people don't know that if it wasn't for Wall Street, our major car companies, there wouldn't have been a Hitler war machine. I recommend to you Anthony Sampson's Sovereign State of ITT. During the 1960s, Senator Bradford Snell released a lot of declassified information that showed that General Motors built major parts for half-tracks for the German regime, that they built airplane parts, that Chase Manhattan Bank Citicorp funded. Basically what happened is they funded both sides of the war, and actually United States corporations got reparations for their corporations in the German territories after the war was over. So my point being is, as James Brown used to say, I don't want nobody to give me nothing, open up the door, I'll get it myself. If Bernie can get through single-payer health care, if he can advocate for rational health care distribution, a free college tuition for everyone. There was a time when City University was free. It's not a mystery that this can happen. Right after World War II, the GI Bill funded a generation of people who were high school graduates or less and could have a good quality of life. That no longer exists. What we have to do is continue to fight, redouble our efforts, reach out as far as we can, because Hillary Rodham Clinton is guaranteed to be too far a militarist and too close to corporations.
She's a warmonger!
Bernie Sanders has been an unapologetic socialist since 1962. It's only recently that Democrats have been willing to accept the label of liberals and progressives. And so Bernie comes off because of his authenticity and his sincerity. Hillary is very vulnerable because she has a somewhat questionable background in terms of her dealings and her allegiances. She's too much of an apparatchik, so it's dangerous. And unfortunately, because our people, there's a large number of people in the country who are saying either Sanders or Trump. So if our standard bearer becomes Hillary Clinton, what we have to do is make sure that our movement continues and that Bernie does not just hand over our support to Hillary without major concessions, because this is a sea change in history and we're dealing with a global economic change. Donald Trump is a billionaire. He is the establishment. He's not an outsider. He's a consummate insider.
He's Hitler!
But the problem is, again, we're so seduced by entertainment that we don't look behind the background to see what people actually have done and what they stand for. So I know most people out here are familiar with what we have to do, and as I said, I'm very confident that in the capital region and all of the regions that we're reaching out to, we're going to do well. But for the rest of the country, I'm not sure. I think all we can do is the best we can and continue to the pace that we're on, and let's see what happens.